Hi, I'm Bill Jankowiak. I'm an anthropologist, and I've done research in the People's Republic of China for over 20 years. I first went in 1981 to 83 when China was really classical socialism, and I lived in a city called Huhhot. Huhhot is the capital of Inner Mongolia Autonomous Region. Huhhot was originally founded by a Mongolian prince, Alatahan, but he did not live there very long. He moved back out onto the grasslands, and the city became quickly a Han Chinese city. It was also a strong Buddhist center. Mongolians were influenced by Tibetan Buddhism, and they became Tibetan Buddhist. And in the city there were numerous temples, the largest being Big Temple, another was Shili Tujiao Temple, and Five Pagoda Temple, and these were centers of learning or just worship. Huhhot is located in a very centrally located place in the Inner Mongolia plain. It is about 300,000 square feet. The climate is a bit, for that part of the world, more milder. 10 miles outside of town, just 10 miles, is going north. You go rising up into the Great Green Mountains, and you're onto the steppes. These are the steppes, or the grasslands, that will go from Inner Mongolia all the way to Poland. And it's what the Mongols used. It was essentially their highway, because when they moved carrying their entire livestock with them. Huhhot is unique in the sense that it's a migrant city, but migrants are highly educated compared to the local population. Generally, when we think of migration, we think of poor peasants moving from some hinterland, looking for a better life and becoming, if you will, the new urban poor, taking on services. Huhhot in 1949 only had 2,000 Mongols living in the old city. The rest of the city was composed of Han Chinese and Chinese Muslims, and called Wei. Good. Because of the work unit system, Mongolians could not pick the housing that they wanted to live in. They had to go where they were assigned. This meant that Mongolians were assigned through many different work units all throughout the city. What's the significance of this for Mongolian ethnicity? Much. Most of all the Mongolians arriving in 1954 could speak Mongolian. When I arrived in the 1980s, none of their children could speak Mongolian. They all spoke Mandarin. How did this happen? Kids copy their playmates in language and behavior style. This is true all around the world. Mongolian children were no different. Since they could not live in a language ghetto, they had to live in the work unit that they were assigned, just like everyone else. This was not a devious plan set up by the central government that destroyed Mongolian ethnicity. They just assigned them to their work unit. But the consequences was there wasn't enough Mongolian kids who could speak Mongolian playing with one another. The kids who could learn Mongolian, that is, they knew what their parents were saying, they might even speak it in the home, refused to speak it with their Han playmates. When you're 4 and 5 years old, the majority is the norm. The end consequences of this, these children grew up into adults who could not speak Mongolian today. The end result of not being able to speak Mongolian has created a crisis of identity to the second generation Mongolians. They are from Mongolian parents, but they speak Mandarin. What is a Mongolian who can't speak Mongolian? I had a good friend who told me about a dream. He dreamt that he was on a horse going to Mongolian Republic, but they wouldn't let him in because he wasn't a real Mongolian, because all he could speak was Mandarin and not Mongolian. The dream is not at all unusual. It's also very real in the sense that Mongolians in Outer Mongolia or the Mongolian Republic look at Mongolians in Inner Mongolia as backward rustic cousins and not real Mongols. How then do Mongolians sustain ethnicity if they do not have a language? I found they do it through two ways. One is through networking. Networking is critically important for maintaining ethnic borders. By associating mostly with Mongolians, they're able to reassure to themselves that they are different than the Han. Another way of maintaining ethnic borders is stereotypes. In many ways, these are ethnic slurs that they joke among themselves. They'll say the Hans are stingy and crafty and you have to be careful. The Hans, for their part, will come back and say Mongolians are stupid and ignorant and easy to be taken advantage of. In many ways, these ethnic stereotypes may have had some validity in the 1930s when Hans were merchants going to the Mongolians and were seen as essentially salesmen, but they have no validity today. They do have salience in conversation only to the extent that they're reminding each other that they are not members of that group. That is, Mongolians are Mongolians and therefore different than Han. In the early 80s, Mongolians would argue often among themselves over who was a pure Mongolian. Grassland Mongolians thought Mongolian language was the essence. Urban Mongols couldn't speak Mongolian, so they weren't pure. They weren't really authentic Mongols. Urban Mongols thought they were, in their heart, Mongolians, and therefore it became one of belief. And that's what they insisted on. The consensus seemed to be, by the 90s, that they were all children of Genghis Khan. It is not at all uncommon today to go to Mongolian houses and see portraits of Genghis Khan. Why in the West, Genghis Khan is often portrayed as a scourge and a barbarian. To the Mongolians, both in the Mongolian Republic and in Inner Mongolia, he is seen as a sage, presented almost as a wise scholar king, and a man that once united all the Mongolians together under one. The ethnic purity issue also hit Mongolian females. Mongolian men said they could pick whoever they wanted, so they could marry a Han Chinese or a Mongolian girl. But Mongolian girls should only marry Mongolian men. This upsetted Mongolian women. They said it wasn't fair for them to be the upholders of ethnic identity, and if it was true for one, it should be true for both. In fact, I found why there was sentiment for ethnic marriage, and many people did marry one another for that reason. People tended to follow personality, and since they were really socialized into the whole Chinese culture, Han Chinese men looked just as favorable to a Mongolian woman as a Mongolian man did. In many ways, more favorable. How? Every Mongolian woman I ever interviewed asked me, do American men beat their wives? Not one Han Chinese woman ever asked me that question. And of course what Mongolian women were referring to was the tradition of grassland Mongols who had a very strong dominant view over family manners. And there was a lingering fear of this cultural survival ideal that they were bringing up. This made Han Chinese men more acceptable. By the 1990s, the issue of ethnic purity no longer was voiced the way it was in the 80s. It seemed to be moot. Mongolians now had more settled into being members of the People's Republic of China. You heard Mongolians talking about Inner Mongolia identity. They would invite people to dinners or to restaurants and said, this is real Inner Mongolian food. And by what they meant by that, it was food that was shared by Han Chinese and Mongolians. This is not surprising, because now you had many Han Chinese that were born in Inner Mongolia. In every way, they were geographically Inner Mongolians, kind of like longtime Californians. In the 1970s, it was rare to find anyone born in LA. But by 2000, it was very easy to find longtime Californians. So too in Inner Mongolia. So too the shift in identity. But there also has something else going on. Mongolians were looking at themselves now as complete members of the People's Republic of China. This was not that they hadn't done it in the 80s, so they certainly had. They were just much more conscious of it. How was this voiced? I once asked a Mongolian if he spoke Chinese, and he looked at me incredulous, and he said, I am Chinese. I speak Han, and I speak Mongolian. By 2000, urban Mongols were talking less about what it meant to be a Mongol and more what it was to be a citizen of the world. Why Mongolians still continue to argue and protest and wonder about government policy and whether it was fair or not. Why many would point out in the 1980s the proportion of Mongolian officials to Han was set up at 50-50 for the high-ranking officials, 80-20 for the low, and 90-10 for the bottom. By 2000, all those percentages had been cut to significantly reaching almost parity. That is, affirmative action for Mongolians had been reduced significantly. How significantly? In the 1980s, the biggest resentment Han Chinese had towards Mongolians was that they had perks. They had certain benefits because of their Mongolian ethnicity. They were given a certain amount of points, over 20 points on the college entrance exam. They were given favorable treatment in terms of promotion. And in many ways, Han Chinese thought this was unfair. They said, this is fair for grassland Mongols who don't have good schools. But the urban Mongols all go to the same schools as we do. They have high-ranking official fathers just like we do. Why are they given more points? We're all individuals. So to the Han Chinese, affirmative action, the government's policy of awarding Mongols to in a certain proportion to Han, was deemed to be simply unfair. By 2000, the affirmative action position had been cut back noticeably. Urban Mongols were given only 7 points, and government officials were not promoted in the same proportion the way they had favoring Mongolian ethnicity. Government policy allows children of mixed ethnic parentage to name the child either Mongolian or Han, or any other ethnicity if they want. I found in the 80s and continuing into 2000 that in the vast majority of cases, the child was named Mongolian. Why was this so? The parents, wanting the best for their child, thought that this would give them a little bit more benefits. It suggests that the Han Chinese do not believe that being Mongol really is going to result in discriminatory practices towards their children. If they did, certainly many more would not label them Mongols. What they really think is Having an official Mongolian ethnicity on their name card, or well, if you will, their internal passport, will ensure them a better chance at life. In 1949, the Communist Party came to power with the notion of creating a new type of Chinese state. With it, they wanted to create a society where people were shared a certain common humanity towards one another, were respectful for individual rights and group differences. To this end, they recognized over 55 ethnic minorities. Now, there are more than 55 ethnic minorities, but to be officially recognized, there's a whole process you have to go through. Mongolians, of course, were easily recognized as one of those 55 minorities. When I returned in 2000, I found Mongolians not as optimistic about the future as they were in the 1980s. While there was lots of arguments among themselves over the meaning of ethnicity, everyone had faith in the government that in somehow things were going to get better. Economically, things have gotten much better in China. But I also found most of my Mongolian friends a bit more bitter, a bit more resigned about the ethnic issue. They recognized that they were Mongolians, they would be respected for Mongolians, but they would never, ever have a privileged place in Inner Mongolia. Inner Mongolia had over 21 million Han Chinese, and there are only less than 3 million Mongolians. This was true in the 80s. The population had expanded even more so in the 21st century. I asked them about Yao Ming. A lot of the Mongolians don't follow basketball, and they didn't care. But some of the Mongolians who had a passion for NBA basketball, they have a TV station that shows the shows on a delayed time scale, said it was wonderful, and they really were very glad he was doing so well in Inner Mongolia, in the United States and in the NBA. When I asked them about the spy plane incidents off of Hainan, he looked at me and said America was wrong. They insulted China. When I asked them, are you happy the Olympics are coming to China? Great eyes swelled with pride and said it'll be wonderful for China. What's the point? Anytime I asked all my Mongolian friends about anything that had to do with China, they were just as typical to the Chinese and on their position. Only when they talked about things having to do with ethnicity did you see a difference. There was one important exception, Taiwan. There is not a Chinese person, a Han Chinese person, if you ask, is Taiwan part of China, that will say with adamant, Taiwan is part of China. That's the official government policy, but it's also one that all the Chinese people feel in their gut. Taiwan is Chinese. But the Mongolians, when I asked them about Taiwan, said, it's their choice. If they want to go, let them. So who are the urban Mongols? They're Chinese citizens, proud of being members of the People's Republic of China. They do, like all members of ethnic groups anywhere in the world, wish to receive greater benefits, more status recognition perhaps, more respect for their ethnicity. There's a pride in an ethnicity, a pride in a history and who they are, but a concern for the future has been documented in so many tribal ethnographies, a concern that their children are merging into a more national characteristic of being just Chinese, and in many ways no longer being seen as Mongolian. China, France, and America all have similar policies towards assimilation. They embrace it, they think it's wonderful. Symbolic ethnicity, that is, you know that who your parents came from, a different background, is okay. But the emphasis is on the individual and the individual's achievement. If the individual can achieve, then the individual is respected for achievement. There is no such thing as group achievement. France, China, and the United States are remarkably well in incorporating people from various ethnic groups and turning them into a new type of national citizens. This, of course, is not followed in Eastern Europe, where people maintain their ethnic identity. And of course, it's the product of ethnic wars. So this raises an interesting problem. Scholars who study China are very sad at the disappearance of ethnic groups. In many ways, they would like to uphold the ethnic group as a kind of an ethnic purity in its own right as it continues. But for the individuals who live in these ethnic groups, moving out their own life courses, they are looking at the world in all of its complexity, and they're picking decisions that are not always following the ethnic lines.